In the long frozen winters of 16th-century Russia, power was not just a crown, it was a weapon forged in blood, fear, and faith. And at the center of that weapon stood Ivan IV Vasilievich, a man history would remember by a single name, Ivan the Terrible. To the world, Ivan was a ruler chosen by God, the first Tsar of all Russia. Crowned in the splendor of Moscow's cathedrals, wrapped in gold and prophecy, but to those who lived beneath his rule, he was something darker. His reign was a storm that promised salvation but delivered only ruin. Ivan's early life had been carved by cruelty. Orphaned as a child in the treacherous halls of the Kremlin, he grew up surrounded by murder and betrayal. The boy who once watched his mother die, possibly poisoned by the Bojars, Russia's scheming nobles, would grow into a man obsessed with control. Every slight became treason, every shadow a threat. The terrors of his childhood had taught him one lesson: to survive, one must dominate. By the time he took the title of Tsar in 1547, Ivan had already begun reshaping Russia with both brilliance and brutality. He introduced laws, reformed the military, and expanded the borders of his realm with relentless campaigns. Kazan fell, Astrakhan followed. The banner of Moscow rose across the steppes. Yet with every victory, something inside him hardened. Power became his faith, and mercy a forgotten word. But for all his paranoia and rage, Ivan the Terrible was not always without tenderness. In his youth, he had truly loved, his first wife, Anastasia Romanovna, whose calm wisdom tempered his storms. When she died suddenly in 1560, Ivan was shattered. He believed she had been poisoned by the Bojars, and from that moment, the Tsar's mind began to unravel. He created the Oprichnina, a secret state within a state ruled directly by him. His black-cloaked riders, the Oprichniki, rode through towns, leaving terror in their wake, burning, torturing, and executing any who defied him. The Tsar's Russia became a land of fear, where silence was safety and suspicion a death sentence. And yet, amid this growing darkness, one small light remained. His son, Prince Ivan Ivanovich, born in 1554, the young prince inherited his father's fierce spirit, but not his cruelty. He was intelligent, disciplined, and devout. Chroniclers wrote that he was strong in mind and body, a reflection of what Russia might have been under a just ruler. To the people, he represented hope, the promise that when the old Tsar's storms had passed, peace might return. But that promise was not to last. The prince grew up watching his father's madness deepen. He witnessed executions without trial, cities burned to ash, and courtiers vanish overnight. Yet, despite the terror, he remained loyal, a dutiful son and capable quarreler. By his early 20s, he was leading military campaigns in his father's name, commanding troops and earning respect from soldiers and nobles alike. To some, this was admirable. To Ivan the Terrible, it was dangerous. Paranoia had already consumed the Tsar. He saw enemies in every corner of his empire, and soon he began to see one in his own blood. Rumors whispered through the Kremlin that the Bojars favored the young prince, that they spoke of replacing the old Tsar with his son. In the fevered mind of Ivan IV, such whispers were poison, and like all poison, it spread quickly. The Tsar began to test his son's loyalty, questioning his every decision. When the prince requested more autonomy in government, or sought to temper his father's cruelty, Ivan saw it as rebellion. Their relationship, once filled with cautious affection, turned into a cold battlefield of mistrust. By 1581, the Tsar was in his late 50s, weary and haunted, yet still feared by all. The realm was decaying under his iron hand. The once glorious campaigns had turned disastrous, most notably the failed siege of Pskov and the humiliating retreat from the Livonian War. The Tsar's confidence crumbled, and in his broken pride, he looked for someone to blame. He blamed the Bojars, he blamed the church, and finally, he blamed his own son. But history's cruelty did not end with accusation. It demanded a tragedy, and it would soon claim one that would shake even Ivan the Terrible to his core. By the winter of 1581, Moscow was shrouded in tension. The air inside the Kremlin felt heavier with every passing week, thick with incense, paranoia, and the echoes of prayers unanswered. The Tsar had grown unpredictable, alternating between manic devotion and violent rage. He would pray for hours in his private chapel, then burst from its doors to condemn another noble to death. His courtiers moved in silence, their faces carefully blank, for even a misplaced glance could be fatal. Within this palace of fear lived Prince Ivan Ivanovich, now 27 years old, a man of striking discipline and integrity, loved by soldiers, and respected even by his father's enemies. He had married a young noblewoman, Yelena Sharamutova, who was known for her kindness and beauty. For a brief moment, there was hope that the future of Russia might yet turn toward light. The people spoke of the prince's wisdom, his humility, and his desire to rebuild what his father had destroyed. He had become a living symbol of redemption, the son who could heal the sins of the father. But Ivan the Terrible's heart had long been a battlefield. He could not bear to share his authority, nor endure the thought that anyone, even his beloved son, might outshine him. The Tsar had surrounded himself with advisers who feared him more than they served him. They whispered against the prince, fueling the Tsar's jealousy with rumors that his son plotted to replace him, and in the depths of Ivan's paranoia, these lies found fertile ground. The breaking point came in November of that year. The prince's wife, Yelena, was heavily pregnant, the promise of a new heir, a continuation of the dynasty. One afternoon, she appeared before the Tsar, wearing clothing that, by his severe standards, was considered immodest. Her sleeves were loose, her gown light, for she was suffering from the heat of her pregnancy. To most men, this would have been nothing. To Ivan the Terrible, it was a scandal, a challenge to his moral authority. Enraged, the Tsar stormed into his daughter-in-law's chambers. His voice, once regal, now cracked with madness as he shouted accusations of indecency and sin. The terrified Yelena tried to explain, but Ivan's fury was beyond reason. He struck her a blow so violent that it caused her to collapse. Within days, the young woman miscarried. When Prince Ivan Ivanovich learned what had happened, something inside him broke. For years he had endured his father's cruelty, his tyranny, his endless suspicion. But this was different. This was his wife, his child, his family. He confronted his father in the royal chambers, his voice shaking with fury and grief. "You have destroyed my wife," he cried, "and with her you destroy your own bloodline." The Tsar's eyes burned with disbelief, or perhaps with the twisted satisfaction of a man who had finally forced loyalty to prove itself through rage. Words became shouts, shouts became threats, and then, in one fatal moment, violence, the Tsar raised his scepter, the heavy gold-tipped staff that symbolized his divine power, and struck his son across the head. The room fell silent. Blood ran down the prince's face. He staggered, but did not fall immediately. The horror of what had just happened seemed to freeze both men in place, father and son, staring at each other, neither quite believing what had been done. The Tsar's attendants rushed forward, but Ivan shoved them away. He tried to cradle his son to stop the bleeding with his hands, but the wound was mortal. As the prince collapsed, he whispered something words lost to history, and the Tsar screamed. Witnesses said his cries echoed through the Kremlin halls for days. The prince was carried to his chambers, where doctors and priests worked in vain. For several days he lingered, fevered, delirious, and in agony. His father refused to leave his side, weeping and praying for forgiveness. The mighty ruler who had brought nations to their knees now knelt beside the dying body of his own son, begging for a miracle that would not come. Then, one cold night in November, Prince Ivan Ivanovich took his final breath. The court fell into silence. The Tsar's heir was dead, and Russia had lost the one man who might have saved it from the darkness consuming its throne. But for Ivan the Terrible, the true punishment had only begun. When the young prince died in November of 1581, the Kremlin became a tomb. The air hung heavy with incense and mourning. Bells tolled across Moscow, their deep voices carrying through the winter fog like laments for the soul of Russia itself. Prince Ivan Ivanovich, the Tsarevich, the heir, the hope of the people, was gone, and his death had come not at the hands of an assassin, not from an enemy's blade, but from his own father's wrath. The Tsar locked himself away for days. Courtiers could hear his wailing through the thick oak doors of his chambers. He refused food, refused counsel, refused even the priests who came to offer him confession. For the first time in his long and violent reign, Ivan the Terrible appeared broken, not by war, not by treason, but by guilt. When he finally emerged, those who saw him swore he was no longer the same man. His beard was unkempt, his eyes hollow. He wandered the palace like a ghost, clutching the scepter that had struck down his own son, as if unable to let go of the very symbol of his crime. The prince's body was laid in state within the Cathedral of the Archangel. The people who came to mourn wept openly, not only for the prince, but for the nation he would never lead. Soldiers knelt before his coffin, bowing their heads to the man they had believed would restore honor to Russia's name. The Tsar attended the funeral dressed in black, his robes torn and his crown absent. Those who stood near him said he whispered prayers without pause, his voice breaking between sobs. He kissed his son's forehead and begged forgiveness, but the dead do not answer. In the months that followed, the Tsar's guilt became a living thing. He ordered endless prayers for his son's soul. He commissioned icons, built churches, and demanded that the name of Ivan Ivanovich be spoken in every service, but none of it could cleanse his conscience. He began to speak of visions of seeing his son standing in the shadows, of hearing his voice in the night. Some claimed that Ivan would sit alone in the prince's old chambers, staring at his empty chair. Others said he kept his son's bloodied robe folded on the altar of his private chapel, a relic of sin that no one dared to touch. And then came the stories, whispered at first, then spreading like frost. That the Tsarevich had not died cleanly, that his body, sealed too soon within its tomb, began to decay unnaturally. Monks who tended the crypt spoke of a strange odor, of the stones sweating as if alive. The people said it was a sign that the sin of the father had poisoned the flesh of the son, that the prince, beloved and pure, could not rest because his death had come from betrayal. In time, these rumors took on a terrible poetry. The tale spread that the prince's body had rotted within the Kremlin walls, his spirit trapped between worlds, a silent witness to his father's madness. And though no historian can confirm such horrors, the image endured. It became the embodiment of Russia's own decay under tyranny, a kingdom rotting from within, just as its heir had rotted in death. Ivan the Terrible lived for 3 more years, and in that time, his paranoia grew to new extremes. He distrusted everyone, his remaining son, Fyodor, the boyars, even the church. He carried lists of imagined traitors wherever he went. His health began to fail. He suffered from seizures, his body racked by the very torment his mind had created. In moments of lucidity, he would try to repent. He would fall before icons, beating his chest, crying that God had abandoned him. "I have killed my son," he would say. "I have killed Russia." But repentance came too late. The empire he left behind when he died in 1584 was broken. His surviving son, Fyodor, was gentle but weak, incapable of ruling the vast and fractured realm. Within a generation, Russia descended into chaos, the time of troubles, an era of famine, impostors, and civil war. The dynasty Ivan had sought to secure through absolute power collapsed beneath the weight of his crimes. And so, in the eyes of history, the death of Prince Ivan Ivanovich was not merely a tragedy, it was the death of Russia's future. Centuries have passed since that dark winter of 1581, yet the story of Ivan the Terrible and his son still haunts Russian memory like a wound that never healed. Historians, priests, and poets have debated its meaning for generations. Was it a moment of madness, or the inevitable consequence of a ruler consumed by his own power? The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere between. What we know is this: the death of Prince Ivan Ivanovich marked a turning point, not only in one man's life, but in the destiny of an empire. In killing his son Ivan, the Terrible destroyed the one bridge between tyranny and renewal. The heir who might have restored balance to the realm was gone, and with him, the last thread of mercy in the Tsar's heart. After Ivan's death in 1584, Russia entered one of the darkest periods in its history. The weak Tsar Fyodor inherited a throne that no longer commanded unity or faith. The boyars, long suppressed by Ivan's terror, fought among themselves for control. Foreign armies marched across the borders. The land itself seemed to rebel. Crops failed, villages burned, and whole regions fell into famine. In a cruel irony, the sins of the father were visited upon the nation itself. The rot that had begun in the palace spread outward until it consumed the body of the state. In later centuries, chroniclers and painters would return to that single moment, the blow of the scepter, the look of horror in the Tsar's eyes, the blood on the floor of the Kremlin. Among them was Ilya Repin, who in 1885 unveiled one of the most haunting works of Russian art, Ivan the Terrible and his son Ivan, on November 16, 1581. In the painting, The Tsar kneels beside his dying son, his face twisted in terror and regret. The prince's eyes stare upward, his hands clutching at his father's robe. The red of his blood glows brighter than any other color in the canvas, a single stroke of violence that tells the whole story. When the painting was first displayed, it caused an uproar. Some demanded it be banned, calling it blasphemy, not against the church, but against the myth of Russian strength. Others wept openly before it, for in those haunted faces they saw not just two men, but the eternal conflict between love and power, faith and fear. And perhaps that is why this story endures, because at its heart, it is not only about kings and empires, it is about the human soul, about how the quest for control can consume the very things it seeks to protect, about how even the greatest of rulers can become prisoners of their own fears. Ivan the Terrible wanted to make Russia strong. He wanted to cleanse it of corruption, to unify it under God and crown. But in doing so, he became the very monster he swore to destroy. His love for his son was real, yet it was love poisoned by suspicion and pride. And in a single moment of rage, that poisoned love became death. The chronicles say that in his final days, Ivan the Terrible spent hours praying before an icon of Christ. His courtiers often found him muttering the same words, "Forgive me, my son." He died on March 28, 1584. While playing chess, a fitting end for a man who treated life and death as pieces on a board. Some say he collapsed with the name of his murdered heir on his lips. As for the boy prince, history remembers him not for what he did, but for what he might have done, the promise of a gentler Russia that never came to be. His tomb lies beneath the great cathedrals of the Kremlin, silent and sealed. But his story remains a mirror, reflecting the cost of power, unrestrained. In the end, the tragedy of Ivan Ivanovich is not just the tale of a father who killed his son. It is the story of how love, when corrupted by fear, becomes destruction. It reminds us that empires do not fall only through invasion or rebellion. Sometimes, they collapse from within, when those who rule forget that their greatest duty is not to command, but to protect. And so, centuries later, the bells of Moscow still toll for the Tsarevich who never reigned, the boy prince who rotted in his father's palace, and in doing so, left behind a warning carved deep into the heart of history. A warning that no throne, however mighty, can escape the judgment of its own conscience.